1,000 camels crossed a sea of sand, a place where nothing could live. Their secret wasn't magic. It was an oasis, an artificial one, an engineering triumph from the ancient world. One that everyone overlooks. Forgotten civilizations rewrote the map. They carved pockets of life from the void. They fueled history's greatest expeditions. Engineers tapped water, water hidden deep beneath mountains. A mighty kingdom drank from ancient lakes, lakes that vanished. These are the stories of the sanctuaries. The ones that built our world. What's the limit, the ultimate limit of human ingenuity, when you're facing an impossible environment? The desert wasn't just empty space. It was an enemy. To understand what they were up against, you have to see it the way they saw it. A place defined by what wasn't there, what was missing. Water, that was the first barrier, an aridity so deep it felt like a force. A few days out there under that sun without a protected supply, and your body would just dry out. It was a steady drain, a quick end, and the temperature was a trap. The daytime heat could blister you, cook the air until it shimmered. Then night would come, and a cold that went right into your bones. That cycle alone was a test, a daily grind, but the real challenge was the distance. The gaps between water sources, a spring, maybe a seasonal pool, those stretches were often too far. Farther than a loaded caravan could go before its supplies ran out. Those weren't just spaces on a map. They were death zones, and the desert would fight back. A sandstorm could come up without warning, a roaring amber wall. It would scour your skin, blind you, erase every trail, leave you disoriented in a sea of nothing. Then there was the weight of it, the monotony, the scale, the isolation under that huge sky. It wore down your spirit, just like the heat wore down your body. That was the void, an active siege. A multi-sided attack on human presence, which makes what they did next not just clever. It was revolutionary. It was the moment they decided to stop just surviving the desert's rules and started to change them. They decided to build a hidden river, not to find an oasis but to make one. That's where this really starts, with the first great engineered solution. It begins far away, up in the foothills of distant mountains where the rain falls. Ancient Persian engineers looked at that land and saw a promise. Rain and snowmelt would seep down, pooling deep underground in vast aquifers. Their genius was figuring out how to reach that buried water, how to guide it, like putting a leash on a powerful animal and leading it to where it was needed. They perfected a system called the Kanat, a gently sloping tunnel carved through rock and earth. It starts deep underground at the water source, and from there the tunnel runs for miles. Sometimes dozens of miles, with just enough downhill slope that the water flows forward, pulled only by gravity. But building it, you start by digging a master shaft straight down. Sometimes over 100 feet deep until you hit the water table. That's your well. Then you work backwards. From the spot in the barren valley where you want the water to emerge, you dig the main tunnel upward toward that master shaft. All along the route, teams dig a line of vertical shafts down to meet the tunnel. These shafts are like breathing holes. They let workers remove debris. They provide air, and for centuries after, they allow for maintenance. The whole thing is a masterpiece of silent, patient engineering. Finally, after years of work, the tunnel breaks the surface. And what was a dry, empty plot of land suddenly has a permanent spring. Water bubbles up from the earth, cool and clean, having traveled unseen for miles. That single point of emergence became the heart of everything. Gardens bloomed around it, date palms and fruit trees took root, crops were planted, a small settlement would grow. This was no accident. It was a deliberate injection of life into a place that had none. The Kanat was more than a water source. It was the foundation for a new kind of desert civilization. These engineered oases became the ultimate pit stops for the massive caravans. A caravan master plotting a route would aim for valleys known to have Kanat systems. Here his 1,000 camels could drink, his people could rest in the shade of cultivated trees, trade for fresh food grown right there. The Kanat didn't just quench thirst. It resupplied entire expeditions, turned an impossible journey into a calculated route. This technology was so effective, so elegant, that it spread like the water it carried. From its Persian heartland, the knowledge traveled along the Silk Road, adopted and adapted by cultures across Central Asia and into North Africa, a hidden network. A subterranean web of life giving arteries beneath the sands. Its success relied on understanding the land's hidden geometry, the slope of the earth, the flow of water, the patience to work with the landscape, not against it. The desert defined the rules of survival, but with the Kanat, humanity wrote a new chapter. They proved even the most barren earth could be persuaded to give life if you knew how to ask, and this was only the first answer, because sometimes the water wasn't hidden in mountains. Sometimes it was hidden in time. The Kanat needed a mountain. It needed that distant, rainy highland to feed it. But what if you were in a canyon, surrounded by sheer cliffs, in a place where rain was rare and violent when it came? You'd need a different logic for water. That brings us to the Nabataeans and Petra. Their home was a deep, protective rift in the desert, a fortress of rose-red stone. But that same geography trapped them. There were no distant aquifers, no gentle slopes for a Kanat. Their water had to come from the sky, in sudden, violent bursts. And they had to catch every drop, so they turned their city and the trade routes around it into one giant machine for harvesting rain. Their genius was vertical. Where the Kanat moved water horizontally, the Nabataeans mastered capturing it from above, holding it in place. They sculpted the landscape. Engineers carved channels and dams into the cliff faces to intercept the flash floods that roared through the canyons. These weren't just barriers, they were intelligent filters, diverting the muddy torrents away from the city into a prepared network. But the real marvel was storage. They carved cisterns, not simple holes, vast, waterproof tanks hewn into the solid bedrock. Imagine a room-sized cavity. Its walls smoothed and sealed with a special plaster hidden inside the living rock. One of these could hold enough water for hundreds of people for months. And Petra was filled with them. This was a civilization that banked water like gold, saving the bounty of a brief, fierce storm to last a year. They didn't just hoard it. Their power, their wealth, came from applying this system to the desert at large, along the incense road, the vital trade artery from Arabia to the Mediterranean. The Nabataeans built a chain of waystations, each one centered on a fortified cistern, carved and maintained in the wilderness. A caravan from southern Arabia faced a 2-month journey across the Nafad. The spacing of these cisterns turned that impossible trek into manageable leaps. A caravan master knew in 5 days he'd reach the Nabataean cistern at a place like Humaima. His animals could drink, his skins refilled. For this, the Nabataeans charged a price, a tax on the water, on the safe passage they guaranteed. They transformed a basic need into the foundation of an empire. Controlling water was controlling trade, and that was controlling power. Petra wasn't just a beautiful city in the desert. It was the central valve in a hydraulic network that made the desert crossable. Their legacy is that scarcity can be the mother of profound ingenuity. When you can't find a river, you learn to build a sky. The water wasn't always in mountains or the sky. Sometimes it was in the deep past. In the Sahara, the most unforgiving desert, a civilization faced a different problem. No mountains to tap, the rains were almost a myth. Their solution echoed the Kanat, but its source was something else. They called it the foggara, and it didn't reach for a living aquifer, it reached for a ghost. The Garamantes, their kingdom in what's now Libya, They looked out at a hyper-arid landscape, rock and sand under a relentless sun, but beneath their feet was a treasure from a different world. An ancient sea, or maybe prehistoric lakes, had once covered the region. Over millions of years that water seeped down, trapped in deep sandstone layers. This was fossil water, water that fell as rain when early humans first walked the earth, a finite bank account sealed underground, no river or rain to refill it. Their engineering was monumental. Like the Persian Kanat, the foggara was a gently sloping underground tunnel, but the scale was staggering. They dug not dozens but thousands of kilometers of these channels. A vast hidden grid beneath the sands. They'd start where the fossil water was closer to the surface, tunnel for miles to bring it to their settlements in lower valleys. The work was brutal, carving through rock in the stifling dark with hand tools and a profound understanding of gradients. Each vertical shaft was a testament to that labor. A pinprick of light marking the hidden river's path. Where the water emerged, life exploded. They created not just one oasis but a belt of them, a green ribbon in the burnt orange void. Fields of wheat, barley, date palms flourished where nothing should have grown. These oases became the beating heart of the Garamantes kingdom. Fortified towns rose around them. And these pockets of life became waystations for something bigger. They formed the early backbone of trans-Saharan trade routes. Caravans carrying gold, salt, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean coast could now make the impossible crossing. Knowing that at calculated intervals a Garamantes oasis would offer water, food, and rest, the kingdom grew wealthy and powerful, not in spite of the desert, but by unlocking its deepest, oldest secret. But that secret had a cost. The Garamantes weren't just using water, they were mining it. Every barrel drawn from a foggara was a subtraction from a pool that would never be refilled. They were living on geological time, spending an inheritance that took epochs to accumulate. Their civilization is a breathtaking testament to human ingenuity. They looked at the ultimate barrenness and said, "We will build a garden." Yet their story carries a quiet, inevitable lesson. Over centuries, the water table began to fall. The foggaras ran dry, the oases shrank, the green belt faded back into the tawny hues of the desert. The kingdom that had mastered the void was eventually reclaimed by it. Their legacy is a double-edged sword. It shows the staggering heights we can reach when faced with scarcity, but it also whispers a warning about the limits of even our greatest works when they outpace the natural rhythm of renewal. They built a paradise on a non-replenishing well, and for a glorious, centuries-long moment it was enough. These engineering feats didn't just happen. They came from a huge, organized human effort. Take one Kanat tunnel miles long underground. That wasn't a job for a few people over a season. That was a commitment lasting decades, needing a small army of workers. And who commanded that? Usually a king or a temple or a powerful city. Only a central authority with real resources could feed and house and protect hundreds of laborers for years. It was a massive investment, a gamble on the future. The ruler wasn't just building a water channel, he was building a new source of agricultural wealth. A new tax base, a new stop on a trade route that would enrich his kingdom for generations. The project itself became a social engine, pulling people from across a region toward one monumental goal. But labor alone wasn't enough. The real magic was in the knowledge. The master engineer, the Mukani, held secrets passed down from teacher to apprentice over centuries. This was a living science, not written in books but in practice. He knew how to read the landscape, where to stand on a barren plain and sense, from the plants or the lay of the land, where the underground water was closest to the surface. He could calculate the perfect, gentle slope, maybe a 1-meter drop for every 1,000 using just simple sighting tools. Too steep, and the water would rush too fast, eroding the tunnel. Too flat, and it would stagnate. He understood geology, how to shore up a wall of loose gravel to prevent a collapse in the dark, airless depths. That knowledge was priceless. It was the difference between a life-giving spring and a tomb of collapsed earth. The work itself was a study in endurance, in coordination. Teams would start by digging the vertical shafts, those breathing holes on the surface. Each shaft team worked in isolation, lowering themselves down, digging out the earth, hauling it up in baskets. Deep below, another team worked horizontally, carving the main tunnel from the destination back toward the source. They worked by the faint light of oil lamps, in stifling heat, guided by shouted directions and ropes to keep the alignment true. It was dark, dangerous. Profoundly skilled labor. A collapse was a constant fear. The sound of creaking earth, a trickle of soil from the ceiling. Those were warnings that needed an instant, expert response. This system created a legacy, a shared purpose. A finished Kanat wasn't just owned by the king. Its maintenance became a community responsibility, governed by strict rules and water rights. The families who dug it or lived by its water were bound to it. They knew every meter of its course. They did the annual cleanings, removing silt to keep the flow clear. This wasn't just infrastructure. It was a covenant between a society and the landscape it had dared to reshape. The oasis was the prize, but the real achievement was the collective human will that made it possible. It showed the greatest desert wasn't outside. It was the space between an idea and its execution, and they crossed that too. The real genius of these oases was their location. They weren't random. They were placed deliberately, like pieces on a board. The problem was distance. A loaded camel in that heat could only go about 5 to 7 days without water. That's maybe 100 kilometers. Any gap longer than that, and the trade route died. So they surveyed the desert. They found every natural spring, every seep. And then they built a bridge with a kanat or a cistern. They put an artificial oasis right where it was needed to close that gap, to turn a lethal stretch into a 5-day journey. One by one, they linked these points of survival. A dangerous trail of chance became a predictable highway. You could plan a journey for months, knowing that on the 5th evening, you'd see the date palms of the next oasis. That reliability changed everything. Trade went from a gamble to a calculation, and at certain points where major routes crossed, these oases became more than watering holes. They became hubs. Think of Palmyra in the Syrian desert or Timbuktu on the Niger, cities born from the logic of the camel and the water jar. Here, the caravan from China met the merchant from Rome. Spices from India traded for glass from Alexandria. Buddhist texts moved with silk and pepper. Languages mixed in the markets. Architectural styles blended. These were the grand crossroads. In that way, the chain of oases was like the internet of its age. But the connections were hydrated corridors, and what flowed was information, culture, commerce. A new idea could travel from the Mediterranean to the Tarim Basin with a scholar in a caravan. A technology in metalworking could spread, oasis by oasis. These calculated points of survival did more than keep people alive. They bound continents into a single, talking network, a dialogue across thousands of miles, made possible by putting water exactly where it was needed to keep the conversation going. Water was a kind of power, liquid power, and power had to be guarded. An oasis stood out in an empty land. It was a target. Its existence was a challenge. So the people who survived there, the engineers, they became architects of defense. It wasn't just about digging channels or carving cisterns. They built fortresses around them. Walls went up, high walls of mud, brick, or stone, to circle the spring, the trees, the food stores. Watchtowers were placed along these walls. Sentinels could see the horizon, the shimmer. The first defense was always to see, to spot the dust of a caravan or the darker cloud of raiders from as far off as possible. This need for security shaped everything. The layout of these waystations, the caravanserai, that fortified inn, it was often the main stronghold. Its gate was massive, thick, inside a single courtyard. That was the safe zone, storerooms below, rooms above, all facing inward. The design was a fortress turned inside out, blank outer walls facing the desert, life bustling inside. Merchants could rest there, their goods, their animals, the water, all behind the same barrier, but the protection went deeper. It went to the water itself. The mouth of a Kanat, where the water emerged, was often inside a fortified room, locked, guarded. Irrigation channels for the gardens might run through tunnels behind more walls. That made them hard to poison, hard to divert in a siege. The Nabataeans, they took this further. In Petra, their cisterns, their water channels, they carved them right into the cliff faces. The canyon walls were the city's fortification. The water system was part of that stone armor. Attacking their water meant attacking a mountain. Control of one fortified oasis could mean control over hundreds of miles of trade. Kingdoms understood this. They put soldiers there, permanent garrisons, a remote outpost like Humaima in the Nafa Desert. It wasn't just a watering hole. It was a military base, barracks, a commander's house, a loyal population. These soldiers guarded the corridor. They ensured safe passage for friendly caravans for attacks and stood ready to fight off rivals. The oasis became a tool, a geopolitical tool. Its fortifications were a statement. They said, this life, this passage, it belongs to us. You can see this legacy. In the Sahara, the Sour, those fortified villages, towering, windowless walls, a single gate, built around a central well. The community lived stacked upward, wealthier families higher up, all oriented toward defending the heart of the place. The architecture tells that story, a story of constant watchfulness. It whispers that the biggest threat wasn't the desert's emptiness, it was what that emptiness could hide. The sanctuary had to be a citadel, because in a world of scarcity, the source of life was the ultimate prize. Securing it required another kind of engineering. Not of water, but of stone and strategy. This constant defense, though, it points to something deeper. The value of these oases wasn't just in the water they held. It was in the connections they guarded. To see the full scale, you have to look at what flowed along those protected paths. The oasis wasn't just a fortress of water. It was a garden, a pocket of green life built from nothing. Water was the first miracle, the second was soil. The ground around a desert well is often just sterile dust. It has no nutrients, no structure for anything to grow, so they brought the soil to it, caravan after caravan, over years, hauling baskets of fertile earth from distant river valleys. They were importing the foundation for an ecosystem. They mixed this with compost, with manure from their animals, creating a rich, dark bed in the heart of the pale desert. That was patient work, a long-term investment in fertility. Then came the walls, not stone walls, green walls. The desert wind carries sand. It's a slow, relentless tide that can bury a seedling in a day. To stop it, they planted living barriers, rows of tamarisk trees or tough desert shrubs. These acted as windbreaks. They caught the blowing sand, creating a still zone behind them. A protected space where more delicate things could take root. That was the first layer of defense for the garden, and at the center of it all stood the date palm. This tree wasn't just a plant, it was the ultimate desert engineering tool. Its deep roots tapped the water table without wasting a drop. Its broad, feathery fronds cast a dense, moving shadow on the ground below. That shade was a microclimate. It lowered the temperature by several degrees. It reduced evaporation from the soil. In that coolness, other crops could survive. Vegetables like onions, cucumbers, beans, fruit trees like pomegranates, figs, citrus. The date palm created the conditions for an entire layered garden to exist beneath its canopy. But the palm gave more than shade. Its fruit was perfect caravan food. Dates are dense in calories and sugar. they're naturally preserved, lasting for months. A sack of dates was a compact energy store for the long journey, and every part of the tree was used. The trunk became beams for buildings. The leaves were woven into mats, baskets, roofing. The fibrous sheaths made rope. Nothing was wasted. The palm was the pillar of the oasis economy. These gardens served a purpose for the great expeditions. A caravan arriving after a brutal week in the sands didn't just need to drink. It needed to eat, to resupply. The oasis garden provided fresh vegetables to ward off illness. It provided fodder, alfalfa, barley, to fatten the exhausted camels and donkeys. It provided fruit for trade. A caravan master could exchange goods for a fresh load of dates, for bags of grain, for bundles of fodder. The oasis wasn't a pit stop, it was a full-service port. It could repair an entire expedition, from the health of its people to the strength of its animals. This transformation from a muddy well to a fertile, shaded garden was the final step. It turned a point of survival into a place of revival. The water allowed life. But the soil, the windbreaks, the clever use of the date palm, they allowed a society. They allowed a pause in the harshness of the journey that was more than just rest. It was renewal. The ultimate goal wasn't just to cross the desert. It was to make the desert, in these small, defiant pockets, livable, even welcoming. The chain of oases was a chain of these tiny, engineered worlds, each one a testament to the idea that with enough knowledge and enough will, you could build a sanctuary not just from thirst but from barrenness itself. The oasis had a garden, but the real pulse was inside the caravanserai. That was the heart of everything, a fortress for commerce and community. You'd see this huge, square building rising from the plain. High walls, no windows, made of mud, brick or stone. A single heavy gate, iron-reinforced, was the only way in. That imposing exterior wasn't just defense. It was a promise, safety, in a landscape that offered none. Once that gate swung shut behind the last camel, you entered another world. The central courtyard was vast, open, buzzing. Along the ground floor, a continuous arcade of arched doorways led to storerooms, each one rented by a merchant for silks, spices, precious metals. Above, up staircases, were the simple lodging rooms, where travelers could finally sleep. At the center of the courtyard was the well, the literal lifeblood of the place. But the caravanserai was more than a hotel with a wall. It was a self-contained ecosystem for trade. Stables lined the interior walls, sheltering hundreds of camels, donkeys, horses. Blacksmiths had forges ready to repair a wagon axle or shoe an animal. Specialists were there, veterinarians, doctors, tending to beasts and merchants after the harsh journey. This standardization was the genius. A trader from Samarkand arriving at one in the Syrian desert knew exactly how it worked. He knew where to stable his animals, where to barter for fodder, where to find a money changer. That predictable rhythm, 5 or 6 days of travel, then a night or two of secure rest, that's what made long-distance trade a calculable business. Not a deadly gamble, the caravanserai became the marketplace itself. In that secure courtyard, deals were struck. Chinese porcelain to Rome, African ivory to Baghdad. News and gossip flowed as freely as the water. A merchant might hear of a bandit threat down the route or learn a new price for pepper. It was a hub of information. A nerve center in a vast, silent network. Its design became a universal language, from the caravanserais on the Silk Road to the funduks of North Africa to the khans of the Levant. The blueprint was consistent: a fortified square, a single gate, a central courtyard. Anyone from any culture recognized it instantly. It was more than architecture. It was an icon, a symbol of safe harbor carved into the world's most perilous spaces. In the immense indifference of the desert, the caravanserai stood as a declaration. It said that across all those miles of emptiness we had built islands, islands of order, of welcome, and of exchange. The oasis and the caravanserai were fixed. They were points on a map, but the engine of the desert was a living creature, the dromedary camel. It wasn't just an animal, it was biological technology. A mobile counterpart to the engineered sanctuary, perfected by nature and then refined by human hands. Its body was a marvel. A camel could lose a quarter of its body weight from water loss and recover in minutes from a single, long drink. Its hump stored fat, not water, a concentrated energy reserve for weeks of travel. Its nostrils could close against blowing sand. Thick eyelashes shielded its eyes. Wide, padded feet were like snowshoes for sand, so it wouldn't sink, and it could eat the tough, thorny plants other animals rejected, turning the barren landscape itself into fuel. This was a creature built by evolution for the exact environment humans wanted to conquer, but the real revolution started with domestication. This wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate, strategic choice. Ancient peoples saw this walking survival kit and saw its potential. Through selective breeding over generations, they enhanced its strength. They bred for endurance, for a calm temperament to handle the stress of long caravans, for a stronger back to carry heavier loads. The camel became a project, a living piece of infrastructure. The result was the ultimate desert vehicle. A single camel could carry hundreds of pounds. It could travel 5 to 7 days without water, covering that critical 100-kilometer gap between oases. Its biology set the rhythm for the entire engineered network. The spacing of the Kanats, the foggaras, the cisterns, all of it was calculated around the camel's physiological limits. The Oasis was the gas station, the camel was the truck. This synergy was perfect and intentional. The fixed points of survival meant nothing without a reliable way to move between them. The camel provided that link. It turned the chain of oases from isolated sanctuaries into a continuous, functioning corridor. A caravan of 1,000 camels wasn't just a line of animals. It was a supply chain on the hoof, a mobile warehouse carrying silk, spices, incense, and ideas across continents. The scale it enabled was staggering. Without the camel, the overland trade that built empires would have remained a trickle. With it, it became a flood. The camel was the living, breathing logic that made the desert's engineered skeleton come alive. It was the pulse moving along the arteries humanity had carved into the void. That living pulse of trade moved through corridors carved from emptiness. And the direct result of those engineered networks was the most famous overland trade routes in history. They were the physical internet of the ancient world. Their servers were the oases. Take the Silk Road, that web of paths across Central Asia. Its most terrifying stretch was the Taklamakan Desert, a name that means place of no return. To cross it, you relied on a string of oases along its northern and southern edges. Each one was a lifeboat in a sea of sand, and many weren't just natural springs. They were sustained by systems like Kanats drawing water from distant mountains, the Kunlun Mountains, the Tian Shan. A merchant from Chang'an in China would load his Bactrian camels with silk. He'd follow that chain of green dots for weeks, from Dunhuang to Khotan to Kashgar. Each stop let him rest, resupply, trade. Without that calculated chain, the silk never leaves China. To the south, another desert highway thrived, the Incense Road, from the frankincense groves of southern Arabia to the markets of Gaza and Petra. This route crossed the brutal emptiness of the Arabian Peninsula. Its viability depended entirely on hydraulic works. The Nabataean cisterns were its fuel stations. A caravan from the kingdom of Saba, loaded with aromatic resin, would plot its course from one known cistern to the next. The Nabataeans didn't just provide the water, they provided security. They collected the taxes that turned cent into gold, but calling these routes mere conduits for luxury goods misses the point. Yes, they carried silk, spices, frankincense, and myrrh, but they transported something far more valuable: ideas. Technologies moved with the merchants. The knowledge of papermaking traveled from China to the West. Designs for water wheels or stirrups for horses spread the other way. Religions found new ground. Buddhism moved from India into Central Asia and China along those oasis corridors. Nestorian Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism all flowed with the caravans. Languages blended at the caravanserais, creating new hybrid tongues for trade. People moved, they married, they settled, creating new communities at these crossroads. The genetic and cultural tapestry of Eurasia was woven on these journeys. The economic scale is hard to grasp. The wealth was astronomical. A single successful caravan could make its backers rich for life. Cities like Palmyra, Samarkand, and Petra grew fabulously wealthy not by producing goods but by controlling the flow. They were the toll booths, the banking centers, the insurance markets of the ancient world. This wealth funded empires. It built the monumental architecture we still see. The artificial oasis was the indispensable infrastructure. The invisible one, it turned what could have been a trickle of exotic trade into a high-volume, systematic economic engine. It connected the agrarian civilizations of China and India with the pastoral nomads of the steppe and the urban centers of the Mediterranean. For the first time in history, the globe was connected, not by sea, but by strands of engineered survival laid across its most desolate continents. The desert was no longer a barrier. It had become a bridge, and the toll was paid in water, in foresight, and in relentless human ingenuity. But the oasis story goes beyond economics, beyond engineering. It lives in the stories people told. In the human mind, this engineered miracle became something more. It became a symbol of salvation, of divine help, arriving when hope was gone. Across desert cultures, legends grew, hidden oases, places not on any map, revealed only to the pure of heart or the desperately lost. These sanctuaries were often guarded by spirits, by jinn, powerful beings who tested those seeking the water. This wasn't just fantasy, it was a cultural memory, a way of encoding a brutal truth. Finding water wasn't just luck. It was the difference between life and a very difficult end. The awe people felt standing before a spring in the void was so profound it blurred. Was this human genius or a gift from something greater? The line between engineering marvel and divine blessing grew thin. We see this echo in sacred texts. In the biblical story, Moses strikes a rock. Water gushes forth to save the Israelites. That narrative is a direct reflection of the oasis experience, the moment of impossible salvation, water from stone. It translates the caravan's physical struggle into a spiritual parable. The message is clear. In the deepest barrenness, providence can provide a way. This symbolism crystallized into the concept of paradise itself. In Islamic tradition, the garden is a central image of the afterlife. Eternal shade, flowing rivers, abundant fruit. The descriptions are strikingly familiar. They mirror the ideal oasis, the cool shade of the date palm, the sound of running water from a Kanat, the lush abundance of a tended garden. The ultimate reward is framed as the perfect, eternal sanctuary from life's deserts. The oasis became a metaphor for divine grace, for peace, for ultimate fulfillment. These stories served a vital purpose. They reinforced the sacred importance of these places. A legendary oasis guarded by spirits taught respect. It warned against polluting the spring, against taking its bounty for granted. It embedded the rules of survival into myth. The tales passed down weren't just entertainment. They were a survival manual wrapped in wonder. They taught that water was more than a resource, it was a covenant, a trust. So when a weary traveler finally saw the green smudge on the horizon, they weren't just seeing a pit stop, they were witnessing a legend made real. The engineered oasis and the mythical oasis existed in the same space. One was built by human hands with tools and geometry. The other was built by the human spirit with need and hope. Together, they tell a deeper truth. Our greatest creations are never just physical. They become part of our dreams. They shape our understanding of the divine, of salvation, of what it means to be rescued from the brink. The sanctuary in the sand was always two places at once, a reservoir of water and a wellspring of meaning. The oasis in myth has a real echo. Along the Taklamakan, a name that means you go in and never come out, cities grew in impossible green. Dunhuang, Turpan, Khotan. These weren't accidents, they were masterpieces of survival, a case study in how engineered water builds a world. Each city was a fortress against the dunes, held up by a local version of the Kanat called the Karez. The logic was stark. Water came from the ring of mountains around the desert, the Tian Shan and the Kunlun. Glaciers up there held a frozen supply. The problem was getting that meltwater across 100 miles of scorching gravel before it disappeared. The Karez was the answer. Teams tunneled deep into the alluvial fans at the mountain's base, catching the water underground. From there, gently sloping channels began a long, hidden journey toward the oasis. Vertical shafts dotted the surface, marked by rings of dug-out earth, like a secret code, a clandestine river safe from evaporation, delivering its cool gift right to the city's heart. And where the water emerged, civilization erupted. In Turpan, which sits below sea level in a burning basin, the Karez fed vast vineyards. They grew grapes of legendary sweetness, dried them into raisins for the Silk Road. Orchards of apricots and pomegranates, fields of wheat and cotton in neat, shaded rows. The contrast was theatrical. One step outside the Karez zone, and you faced blinding salt flats and lethal heat. One step inside, and you walked through a shaded, fruit-laden garden. Hydraulic alchemy, turning mountain ice into desert plenty, but their ingenuity went beyond the water. The people of Turpan built their homes underground or half-buried to escape the heat, using the earth as insulation, cool in summer, warm in winter. A full-spectrum adaptation, a way of life sculpted by the desert and the genius of the Karez. These oases were more than service stations. They became wealthy, independent Buddhist kingdoms. Khotan was famous for jade and carpets. Dunhuang, guarding the gateway into China, became a cosmic library of cultures. In the Mogao caves, a symphony of influences covered the walls. Serene Buddha figures with Indian draping sat beside donors in Chinese silk robes. Celestial beings flew in poses from Persian art. Hellenistic cherubs floated in the corners. A visual fusion of every idea that traveled the Silk Road, all collected, funded, preserved in this oasis sanctuary. The monks, merchants, artists who thrived here, they could because the Karez never failed. A steady flow of water meant a steady flow of wealth, which meant patronage, security, and time. Time to translate Buddhist sutras from Sanskrit into Chinese and Tibetan. Time to debate philosophy under grape arbors. Time to craft artworks that bridged continents. The hydraulic engineering was the silent foundation for a cultural flowering. It made these cities not just waypoints but destinations. Capitals of a hybrid world that existed because they learned to mine the sky from the mountains. Their eventual silence, swallowed by the shifting sands, shows the fragility of that perfect, engineered balance. While they lasted, they proved the desert could host not just life, but a radiant one. A sophisticated one, 500 foggaras, hidden rivers, thousands of miles of them under the Libyan desert. That was the Garamantes. They lasted 1,000 years. From 500 BC to 500 AD, and they weren't just surviving the Sahara, they were mastering it. Their kingdom was a paradox, a real state thriving in a place where life shouldn't be possible. Their capital was Garama, a true oasis city, mud, brick and stone rising out of nothing, palm groves for shade, fields of wheat and barley all around. All of it fed by that ancient water, fossil water, water they learned to mine. Their reach was extraordinary. Their traders went deep into sub-Saharan Africa. They brought back gold, ivory, slaves. traded these north to the coastal cities of Rome, and from Rome they got glass, wine, olive oil, luxury goods. They weren't isolated, they were a middleman civilization, a crucial link, a transcontinental economy, all made possible by that water, by their hydrological genius. But their story has this duality, this haunting part. The source of their power was also their deepest vulnerability. The fossil water was a treasure, but it wasn't a spring. It was a finite reservoir, a bank account with no deposits. Every barrel drawn by the foggaras was a subtraction. Over centuries, their population grew. Their agricultural demands grew, and the water table began to retreat, a slow, inexorable retreat. The foggaras, those marvels, started to run dry from the source outward. Maintaining them became a desperate battle, a losing battle, clearing silt from miles of tunnel, repairing collapses in the deep dark, all to chase a receding prize. The energy to sustain their world began to exceed the returns. What followed wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a long, quiet fading. The green belt of Oasis shrank. Fields were abandoned, the population likely dispersed, went back to smaller, sustainable pockets. The great capital, Garama, diminished, the trade routes shifted. In time, the kingdom was absorbed. Its memory faded into the desert sands, became a rumor, a ghost story for later travelers. The Garamantes are a lesson in adaptation. The absolute peak of what's possible. When ingenuity confronts scarcity, they built a civilization in a place that defied the idea of civilization. But their legacy is also a whisper of caution. Etched into the landscape they transformed, a reminder that even our most brilliant systems exist within a larger balance. Sustainability isn't just about building something that works. It's about building something that endures for centuries through the inevitable change of the world it depends on. Their forgotten cities are a monument to our ambition and to our limits, a testament written not in stone but in the silent geometry of water and sand. That hidden network under the sand, it didn't build itself. You could have the vision to carve a sanctuary from nothing, but to string hundreds of them together across a continent, that was different, that needed an empire. A single village could dig a Kanat for itself, but to turn that into the backbone of a trade route thousands of miles long, you needed resources on a different scale. You needed soldiers to guard the work, and you needed a map that saw the desert not as an end but as a corridor, something to be crossed and controlled. That's where local ingenuity met imperial ambition. The Persian Achaemenid Empire, they mastered this. Their administrators didn't just allow Kanat construction. They promoted it, they funded it. They saw a direct line between water in the ground and control over the land. By financing these projects in frontier regions, they could settle loyal people there. They could create stable farms to supply their armies, and they could secure the royal road, the trade arteries that filled the treasury. A Kanat was more than a water source. It was a flag planted, saying this place is now Persian and it's open. The later Sasanian Empire doubled down on that. Maintaining and expanding these water networks became a core function of the state. Infrastructure as empire building. Even Rome understood this in its driest provinces. Rome's heart was the Mediterranean, but on frontiers like North Africa or Arabia Petra, the Roman military became an engine for desert engineering. Legions marching through needed reliable water, so the army built it. They sank deep wells along patrol routes. They built massive, fortified cisterns at waystations. They often improved on local systems, Nabataean or others. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. Secure water points meant faster movement for troops. Safe passage for the caravans that supplied the frontier towns that paid taxes. The Roman state provided the capital, the organized labor, and the long-term security. A well dug by a legion could become the seed for a settlement, which grew into a node of Roman influence. They were hydrating their borders, making them permanent. But maybe the most deliberate fusion happened far to the east. For the Chinese Han and Tang dynasties, the Silk Road was a lifeline, a source of wealth, of horses for the cavalry, of prestige. And its weakest link was the Taklamakan Desert. To control the route, they had to control the oases on its edges, so they didn't just use existing towns. They established them. They built garrison forts right beside the springs, the Karez systems. Places like Dunhuang weren't just trading posts, they were military colonies. Soldiers were given land to farm, creating a self-sustaining community loyal to the emperor. The imperial court sent the administration, the engineers, the soldiers to protect the water from raiders or rival kingdoms. This transformed the oasis from an independent city-state into an outpost of a distant capital. The flow of silk was protected by a chain of imperial waystations. Each one a small piece of China projected into the void. In all these cases, the empire provided what local effort alone couldn't: long-term security against bandits, against rivals. The massive upfront capital for projects that took decades, a bureaucracy to maintain the networks, to settle water disputes, to ensure they kept working across generations. Imperial ambition turned a survival tactic into a geopolitical strategy. The oasis became a tool of soft power, a demonstration that the state could create order and abundance even in nature's most defiant places. By building these sanctuaries, empires weren't just claiming territory on a map. They were making the map itself, redrawing the lines of what was possible. Turning impassable wastes into connected space, taxable space, controllable space. The will of an emperor, channeled through countless engineers and laborers, literally made the deserts bloom. And in doing that, they built the arteries, the channels through which the ancient world's lifeblood could flow. Trade, ideas, power, moving steadily. Reliably. The oasis was a victory, but it was never permanent. The desert was patient. It never stopped trying to reclaim what was taken. An engineered oasis wasn't something you built and then walked away from. It was a living agreement, a constant negotiation with the land, and that agreement demanded work, daily, unending work. The Kanat tunnel, that hidden river, was vulnerable. Over time, fine silt would wash in. It accumulated on the floor. It slowly raised the water level until the flow choked off. So once a year, usually in the dry season, teams of cleaners would descend. They entered through the vertical shafts. They carried lamps and tools. They moved through the cramped, dark passage. They shoveled the silt into baskets. They hauled it up to the surface. It was grueling labor, dangerous labor. A collapse was always a risk. A single weakened section could bury a crew, and the tunnels needed more than cleaning. The walls, carved through soft earth, required constant shoring up, timber supports, stone supports. This wasn't optional. It was the lifeblood of the community. Its maintenance was a sacred duty, the same vigilance applied above ground. The mouth of the Kanat, where the water emerged, had to be kept clear. The irrigation channels that branched out to the gardens were like open veins. Wind-blown sand would drift into them. It clogged the flow. Every morning, someone was out there with a shovel, clearing the ditches. The protective windbreaks of tamarisk trees needed pruning. They needed care. The cisterns, those vast underground tanks, had to be periodically drained and scrubbed to prevent algae, to prevent contamination. This was the hidden economy of the oasis. The real cost wasn't just in the initial digging. It was in the forever work that came after. This created a social contract. The water from a single Kanat might feed several villages, many families who got water and when and how much. This was governed by ancient codes, precise codes. Often time was the measure. A water clock, a simple basin with a small hole, would be used to allot shares. A family's turn might be from sunrise until the clock emptied. Their job was to open their channel gate, let the water flow to their plot, then close it for the next in line. The schedule was strict, overseen by a water master. Disputes over water rights could tear a community apart, so the rules were clear, they were fair, they were deeply respected. This wasn't just logistics. It was a culture of shared responsibility, born from the understanding that the resource was fragile. Everyone's survival depended on everyone else's cooperation. The sustainability of the entire system hung on this delicate balance, on the ongoing labor, and on the deep, localized knowledge passed from father to son. The Mukani, the master engineer, knew not just how to build, he knew how to listen to the tunnel, the sound of the water, the feel of the air, the condition of the walls. These were his diagnostics. This was a science of observation, honed over centuries. When that chain was broken, the oasis was doomed. We saw it with the Garamantes. As their political power waned, the immense labor force needed to maintain thousands of kilometers of foggaras likely became impossible to muster. The knowledge of how to repair the deepest sections might have faded with a generation. The water table was falling, yes, but the system's collapse was accelerated by the loss of the social will to fight for it, the technical will. The desert didn't aggressively attack. It simply waited for the vigilance to waver. Then the silt settled, the tunnels clogged, the sand dunes, patient for centuries, finally crept over the abandoned fields. The history of these sanctuaries, then, is not a history of monuments. It is a history of maintenance, of daily, humble effort. It's a story written in calloused hands clearing ditches at dawn. In the careful notes of the watermaster's ledger, in the whispered knowledge of how to brace a tunnel wall, the true engineering marvel wasn't the first gush of water from the rock. It was the 1,000th clearing of the same channel. The real triumph was the social order that made that work meaningful, that made it mandatory. For as long as that vigilance held, the garden flourished. The moment it relaxed, the desert reclaimed its own. This eternal struggle reveals a truth. We can create pockets of order, but only through perpetual care. Conscious care. The oasis was never a conquest. It was a careful, continuous act, holding a space open for life. The desert holds its secrets, but not all of them. For a long time, these water systems were just stories, just marks on the land. Now we're looking, and we're starting to see. From above, with satellites, you can see lines. In Libya, there are these dotted lines that go on for hundreds of kilometers. They're faint. They're the Garamantes foggaras. Each dot is a shaft, filled with sand now, but you can still see the dip in the ground from space. It's a grid, a huge planned grid, like a blueprint drawn right on the desert. On the ground, we use radar. It sends a pulse down and shows you what's there. In Iran, they've traced the path of buried qanats this way. You can see the gentle slope of the tunnel before you dig. It lets you see the whole system. And you realize these weren't just separate ditches. They were networks planned out across whole regions. Then you start digging. At Petra, they've cleared out the channels. The dams cut into the rock. They found the big cisterns underground, still sealed with their original plaster, a mix of lime and crushed pottery. It held. In Palmyra, they found reservoirs and stone inscriptions, but these aren't just royal monuments, they're laws. They list water rights, they set maintenance duties. Penalties for stealing water. It's a legal system built around water to keep it fair, to make it last. In the Sahara, at the Garamantes sites, you see the work. The foggara tunnels are wide enough to crawl through. They're shored up with stone and wood. The tools are there, stone picks, leather buckets, the things that carved those tunnels out of the rock. And sometimes you find the person, a footprint in the tunnel wall, a lamp left behind, just a trace of the people who worked down there in the dark. This changes the story. The old story said desert societies were simple, nomadic, on the edge of things, but this is different. This is central planning, major investment, huge public works. It shows a deep understanding of water, of rock, of the land. What we called primitive wasn't primitive. They were engineers, environmental engineers. Their technology fit their world. They didn't have steel, they didn't have engines, but they had patience, a view that stretched across generations, a deep knowledge of one specific place. They thrived in conditions that would stop us, even with all our machines, because their solutions came from the land. They worked with it, not against it. Every tunnel we find, every inscription we read, it points to a different kind of smart. Success wasn't about conquering nature, it was a negotiation. A long, careful balance. The desert tried to cover it all up, but the works were always there. We just had to learn how to look. The knowledge behind these places couldn't stay put. It moved. The same routes that carried silk and spices carried something deeper, the plans for survival. The oasis concept was like a seed. Traders and migrants carried it, planting it in new deserts. It was technology spreading, a shared response to a universal problem, thirst. The most well-known of these traveling ideas was the Kanat. Scholars point to its start in ancient Persia, in what's now Iran. It was a perfect answer to that landscape, but it worked everywhere. As Persia's trade grew, so did the knowledge of how to build these underground channels. It went west into the dry parts of the Roman Empire. The Romans were practical. They saw how it worked. They took the system and used it in their own provinces from Syria to North Africa. They even gave it a Latin name, fossa, but it also went east. It traveled the Silk Road through Central Asia. It reached the Taklamakan Desert. There, it was adopted and became the Karez. The idea was the same, a gently sloping tunnel, but the adaptation was exact. In the Taklamakan, the water came from mountain glaciers. The Karez became the lifeline for the whole southern Silk Road. From there, it might have gone even farther into western China, and it wasn't just one way. Nabataean skills spread too, their methods for building cisterns for catching floodwater. Their techniques for carving waterproof tanks from rock for channeling rain were seen and copied. The Roman army posted in these areas learned from local practice. Then they made it standard, building fortified cisterns along their desert routes. The garden knowledge traveled as well. The model of the layered garden with date palms for shade and other crops below became a blueprint. The best drought-resistant trees, the right shrubs for windbreaks, how to enrich the soil, all this moved with the caravans. A Persian merchant might settle in an Omani oasis, bringing the memory of how his father pruned a fig tree. An engineer from Petra might find work in a far-off kingdom, offering his skill to build a dam for a new trading post. This exchange was one of the most practical collaborations of the ancient world. There was no patent, no secret to keep. The technology was open because the problem was a shared one. Any caravan from any place faced the same emptiness. A reliable water source helped everyone who came through. It made the whole network stronger, more viable. So knowledge turned into a kind of currency. Something as real as the goods in the packs. It was carried on camels, discussed in caravanserai courtyards, shown in the success of a faraway garden. A trader might not just bring merchandise, he might bring the idea that let the next traders even make the trip. This spread shows us that ancient innovation was often a conversation. A slow, persistent talk across continents pushed by pure need. The desert was the common ground. It asked the same harsh question of every culture, and through trade they shared the answer. Water was power in the desert. If you controlled it, you controlled everything. An artificial oasis wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a weapon, a fortress. A bargaining chip. States understood this. To dominate the trade routes, you had to dominate the oases that made them possible. So if a rival grew too strong, you didn't always march on their capital. You could target their water, seize a chain of Kanat-fed waystations, and you could strangle the luxury goods that funded their armies, cut the water, and you cut the lifeblood of a region. The desert became a chessboard, every green square a piece to be taken or held. Military strategy was hydrological. No army, no matter its size, could march long without securing its water. Campaigns were plotted along the line connecting reliable sources, not the shortest geographic line. A general's first objective was never the enemy's main force. It was the springs, the cisterns, the fortified oasis towns. He who held the water held the initiative. This logic played out in pivotal clashes. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636. A decisive fight between the early Islamic Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. The fighting raged for days near the Yarmouk River, and while the tactics were brilliant, the stage was set by water. Control of the river valleys and the nearby springs wasn't a secondary concern. It was the primary objective. Securing them let the Muslim army maintain its position, its morale, its mobility. It placed the Byzantine forces at a disadvantage. The outcome reshaped the Near East, a victory won not just with swords, but with control over the landscape's life-giving arteries. For empires, oases were instruments of control, but for the nomads who lived there, water knowledge was a tool of resistance. Groups like the Bedouin possessed something empires couldn't easily take or map. The memory of secret water holes, tiny seeps known only through oral tradition. These weren't engineered marvels, they were natural cracks, hidden wells, places where water gathered after rare rains. This knowledge was a supreme asset. It let tribes move freely through territories armies found impassable. They could evade pursuit, launch raids, maintain their independence. Because they knew where to find what no one else could see. Their power came from an intimacy with the desert that no centralized state could fully replicate. So you had this lasting dynamic. The settled state built monumental, fixed points of water to anchor its power. The nomad held the fluid, hidden knowledge of the spaces in between. Their coexistence and their conflict was a dialogue about control. The state would fortify and tax the major oases. The nomads would use their mobility to raid the caravans that used them or offer protection for a price. So the political map of that ancient desert world was drawn in water. Borders weren't just lines on parchment. They were the lines connecting a chain of fortified springs. Alliances were forged over shared water rights. Wars were fought over cisterns. The rise and fall of kingdoms traced by who controlled the wells. This was hydropolitics in its rawest form. A recognition that in a land defined by absence, the presence of water was the beginning and end of all authority. The engineered oasis was never neutral. It was always a statement, a declaration of ownership over the very possibility of life in the void. The silent tunnels, the forgotten cisterns, they hold more than water. They hold a philosophy, a way of thinking about your place in the world, and it feels relevant now. Those engineers weren't just solving a problem, they were living within boundaries. They understood the local carrying capacity. They understood it with a clarity born of necessity. They couldn't import what they needed from another continent. Their world was the water in their mountains, the rain on their cliffs, the ancient pool beneath their feet. Their genius was designing systems that worked within those strict local limits. The Kanat used gravity alone, no pumps, no external power, just the patient pull of the earth. The Nabataean cisterns were passive collectors. They captured what the sky gave in violent bursts. And they stored it against the long dry. These were elegant, low-energy solutions. They turned the environment's own forces into allies, and this respect for limits was encoded into law. The water rights inscriptions at Palmyra, they weren't suggestions, they were the legal framework for survival. They dictated who could use water and when. And how much. They assigned maintenance duties. They imposed penalties for waste or theft. This wasn't bureaucracy for its own sake. It was a community recognizing the resource was finite. That it was fragile, that its fair and careful use was the only thing standing between them and the desert. It was a system of shared responsibility. Enforced by social agreement, for a system to function for 1,000 years, as many did, this social contract was as vital as the engineering. it was sustainability in practice. Not in theory, of course, they weren't perfect. The story of the Garamantes is a cautionary tale. Their foggara system was a masterpiece, but it mined a non-replenishing resource. They built a civilization on a geological inheritance, and when that inheritance dwindled, their system couldn't adapt quickly enough. They overshot their local carrying capacity. It shows that even the most brilliant engineering has an expiration date. If it outpaces natural renewal, their legacy is a reminder. True resilience requires not just building for the present, but planning for the distant future, for changes you might not see in your lifetime. So what does this ancient wisdom whisper to us now, in an era of climate change and resource anxiety? It highlights principles we are struggling to relearn: the value of adaptation, of designing solutions that fit a specific place, using local knowledge and local materials. The critical importance of understanding carrying capacity, whether it's an aquifer, a fishery, or the atmosphere's ability to absorb carbon. And perhaps most powerfully, it shows the strength of decentralized solutions. Knowledge-intensive solutions, the Mukani, the watermaster, held a deep, place-based understanding, a understanding no central planner could ever replicate. Their systems were maintained by the people who depended on them. That created a direct feedback loop between use and care. In a world often seeking grand, technological fixes to environmental crises, these ancient sanctuaries offer a different model. One of humility, of working with the grain of nature, of building societies where the rules for survival are woven into the culture itself. They succeeded not by conquering the desert, but by listening to it. By crafting a careful, continuous answer to its harsh questions. As we face our own expanding deserts, both literal and metaphorical, that might be the most vital lesson they left buried in the sand. Not just how to bring forth water, but how to build a future that knows how to cherish it. The Roman aqueducts were these huge stone arches. They marched across the land. And they were a statement. They showed an empire's power, its ability to conquer the land itself, to bring a river right to the city. Water meant urban power. It meant civilization, all concentrated in one place. The aqueduct was there to feed that, to supply the baths, the fountains, the huge population of Rome. It was water as a public spectacle, a celebration of abundance delivered from somewhere else. Now the Kanat, there's no monument, no arches, just a line of holes in the ground. Like stitches, its power was invisible, flowing underground in the dark. The aqueduct served a city that was already there, but the Kanat, it created the possibility of a settlement. Where nothing could exist before, its goal wasn't to service a metropolis, it was to conjure a village from nothing. That contrast is deep. One technology is a statement of central control. A spine feeding a heart, the other is a decentralized network, a web of life scattered to outwit the emptiness. Then you look at Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. The challenge there wasn't scarcity, it was management. Water was plentiful but unpredictable. Floods could destroy everything, so the engineering triumph was the canal, the dike, the irrigation grid. It was about taming abundance, turning chaotic fertility into orderly, agricultural wealth. The Oasis engineer faced the opposite problem. Their starting point was zero. Their work wasn't about distribution, it was about extraction, creation. It was like alchemy, pulling water from stone, from the sky, from hidden pools deep underground. Mesopotamian systems dealt with the logistics of plenty. Oasis systems dealt with the existential crisis of absence. That fundamental context shaped everything. It bred a different philosophy, one that valued subtlety over spectacle, resilience over grandeur, a deep, patient partnership with a hostile landscape. The Roman aqueduct shouts its purpose, the Oasis Kanat whispers it. One represents the power to bring water to people, the other represents the power to bring people to water. It's not about which was more advanced, It's about how human ingenuity takes the shape of the problem it has to solve. In a desert, the most brilliant solution is often the one you can't see. A hidden thread of life stitched quietly beneath the sand. Every system has a lifespan. It doesn't matter how well it's designed. The desert caravan's golden age didn't end with a battle. It didn't end with a wall falling. It just faded like water going back into the sand. The first change was the horizon, but a different one, the sea. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Arab and Persian sailors were learning the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. They built these ships dehoused that could carry cargo on a scale no camel train could match. Think about it. Why move 1,000 animals through that heat, paying for water, paying for protection at every stop? When a single ship could sail from Oman to India with 10 times the cargo, the economics shifted. Spices, silks, porcelain, they started moving by sea. It was cheaper, it was often faster, and it avoided the politics, the chaos on land that could close a route overnight. The desert highway, for all its engineered perfection, started to look like a detour. A difficult, expensive detour. Then the political landscape fractured. For a time, the Mongol Empire created a peace, the Pax Mongolica. Their control stretched from China to Europe. They secured the Silk Road, they punished bandits, they encouraged trade. It was the last great flourishing of the Overland system. But when that empire fragmented in the 14th century, the security vanished. Warlords rose, petty kingdoms, banditry became rampant, the cost of safe passage skyrocketed. The Caravanserai, once a guarantee, became a target. The predictable rhythm, those 5-day journeys, it broke down. Uncertainty is the enemy of long-distance commerce. Merchants, when they have a choice, they move toward the safer path, the more predictable path, and increasingly, that path was on water. With the trade drying up, the economic heartbeat of the Oasis networks grew faint. A Kanat system isn't a monument, it's living infrastructure. It requires constant cleaning, repair, communal management. When the caravans stopped coming, the wealth that funded that maintenance disappeared. The watermaster's role lost its prestige. The shared social contract, the strict water laws, they began to fray. Why spend weeks in a dark tunnel clearing silt if the bounty it brings is only for your own small village? The scale of the ambition shrank. Communities retreated inward, maintaining only what they needed for subsistence. The grand networks, the chains that spanned hundreds of miles, they were too big to sustain. Without the larger economy that built them, sections were abandoned, tunnels collapsed, cisterns cracked and filled with sand. Nature was always there, of course. In some regions, like with the Garamantes, the water table they mined was finite. In others, broader climate shifts brought increased aridity. A period of drier centuries could mean the mountain glaciers shrank. The glaciers feeding the Karez systems, the underground rivers that fed the Kanats, grew weaker. The engineering was brilliant, but it was built for a specific climate normal. When that normal changed, even slightly, the margins for survival vanished. A garden that needed 10 units of water might only receive 8. It was a slow, quiet pressure, squeezing life from the edges inward. The result was a gradual emptying, not a sudden evacuation, a generational retreat. Families moved to more reliable areas. Knowledge of how to repair the deepest parts of the foggara, it died with the last old engineer who remembered. The sand did the rest. It drifted over irrigation ditches. It buried the lower courses of mud brick walls. It filled the vertical shafts of the Kanats until the dotted lines on the landscape smoothed over. What had been a bustling caravanserai, echoing with languages, became a silent shell. Then a mound, then a legend. This is the origin of the lost city myths. The stories travelers told of seeing stonework peeking from a dune, the rumors of a great city swallowed by the sands. They were often memories, echoes of places like Yuba in Arabia or cities of the Garamantes. They weren't lost to catastrophe, but to a slow, economic forgetting. The desert didn't attack, it simply waited and then gently took back what was always on loan. The hubs of global connection became coordinates for treasure hunters. For archaeologists, their silence today is a testament to a truth. No sanctuary, no matter how ingeniously built, exists in isolation. It's part of an ecosystem. Economic, political, climatic. When that wider system changes, the oasis must adapt or be reclaimed. The sand holds not just the ruins of cities, but the faded blueprint of a connected world. A world that chose for a time to move by land. That dialogue with the desert, it never really stopped. You can still hear it in the sound of a city, a modern city, built where water is just a memory. Places like Marrakech or Phoenix, Riyadh, they're the direct descendants of the oasis. They face that same basic equation. A huge population, a deep thirst, and a landscape that gives you almost nothing. The technology is different now, but the core challenge is the same. We still have to find the water, store it, and share it fairly across a vast, dry space. Today, we drill wells, thousands of feet down, tapping fossil aquifers, just like the Garamantes did, but now it's on a planetary scale. We build massive dams, huge reservoirs. They're the monumental cisterns of our age. We even pull water from the sea, desalination, a kind of alchemy they could only imagine. But under all the concrete and steel, the old principles are still there. Whispering the need for meticulous allocation, the critical importance of storage for the drought, the social imperative of distribution. A water utility manager in Arizona today is, in spirit, doing the same job as a Nabataean engineer. Or a Palmyran water master. They're stewards of a fragile lifeline in a land of scarcity, and in some places, the old systems themselves, they're still alive. In parts of Iran, in Oman, carefully maintained qanats, they're called a flage in Oman. They still water fields, date palm groves, they're not relics, they're living infrastructure. Still governed by centuries-old community codes for sharing water, their value is dual now. They provide a sustainable source, gravity-fed, and they're cherished as heritage. A tangible link to a deep, place-based wisdom. A wisdom about how to live within a desert's means. They remind us that our newest solutions, they might not always be the most resilient. You can see this legacy in our most ambitious modern projects too, the ones confronting desertification. The Great Green Wall in Africa, aiming to grow a belt of trees across the Sahel. It's a staggering vision, a windbreak but on a continental scale. A direct spiritual successor to those living barriers planted around ancient oasis gardens. The goal is the same, to hold back the encroaching sand, to create a better microclimate, to make the land productive, secure for communities, and then there's solar-powered drip irrigation in arid regions. That's the latest chapter in precision water delivery. The high-tech evolution of the carefully timed water shares from a Kanat, every drop measured. Placed exactly where it's needed, minimizing waste in an environment where waste is a luxury. These endeavors, they continue that ancient conversation. It's a dialogue of resilience, of looking at a landscape that seems to refuse life and asking, how can we work with this? How can we apply our ingenuity to create a sanctuary here? Not just for a season, but for generations, the tools have changed, from stone picks and leather buckets to satellites and polymers, but the intention, it connects us across the millennia. We are still those engineers, standing at the edge of the void, measuring the slope of the land, listening for the hidden water, and daring to build a pocket of green in the great golden silence. The desert's question remains, and our answer, it's still taking shape. Even the most brilliant engineering leaves questions. We've uncovered so much about these desert sanctuaries, but deep mysteries are still buried. How did the first Garamantian engineers find those deep fossil aquifers? They had no satellites, no ground-penetrating radar. Their tools were observation and a profound knowledge of the land passed down through generations. They read subtle signs, the types of plants in certain wadis, the way the rock fractured, maybe even the taste of the soil. It was a science of intuition honed over lifetimes. A sacred craft. We can map their foggaras from space now, but we may never fully grasp the sensory wisdom that told them where to dig, and the true scale of their network is still unknown. We've traced lines of shafts across hundreds of kilometers, but the desert is vast. Were there branches that served remote outposts, now completely erased by dunes? Could entire, smaller oasis settlements be waiting, their outlines visible only to the most sensitive LiDAR scans from the air? Every survey flight has the potential to reveal another stitch in that subterranean tapestry. Then there's the quiet mystery of the teachers. We know the Kanat technology spread from Persia, but how? Was it a single master engineer traveling with a caravan hired by a distant king? Or was it a slower diffusion? A local tribe sees a working system at a trade hub and spends decades reverse engineering the principle. The transfer of that kind of hands-on knowledge is a story written in gestures and shared labor, not in text. We see the result everywhere, but the moments of instruction are lost. This is where modern science steps in, offering new ways to listen. Archaeologists use isotopic analysis on mineral deposits inside ancient cisterns. The chemical signature of the water can tell us where it originally fell as rain centuries ago. Was it local, or did it travel from distant mountains? That traces the hydrological story in a way inscriptions never could. Researchers sift through sediment in long, dry oasis gardens. They look for ancient pollen grains perfectly preserved. A sudden change in the pollen record from desert scrub to date palm and cereal grains marks the precise moment the irrigation began. And later, a return to desert pollen tells the exact story of the oasis's abandonment. It's an environmental diary, page by page. LiDAR technology is revolutionary. It uses laser pulses from an aircraft to map the ground surface, stripping away the veil of vegetation or sand. In places like the Negev, LiDAR has revealed the ghostly footprints of farms, canals, roads leading to springs no one has seen for 1,000 years. It shows the ambition of the system in a single image. Each of these discoveries is a piece of the puzzle, a correction to the historical map. They remind us that the narrative of human ingenuity is never a closed book. It's a story still being uncovered, word by word, often written in layers of dust and the faint traces of root systems. The answers aren't always in grand monuments. They're in the chemistry of a water stain, the shape of a seed, the faint shadow of a wall under a dune. The desert safeguarded these secrets for ages, but it is finally beginning to share them. And with every revelation, we gain not just knowledge of the past, but a deeper appreciation for the quiet, persistent genius that once turned the impossible into a highway. The artificial oasis wasn't just a clever trick. It was a single testament to human ingenuity pushed to its limits. These sanctuaries were never just about water. They were the physical intersection of multiple disciplines working together. You needed geology to understand where the water was hidden, hydrology to know how it moved and how to guide it, logistics to space these points along a caravan's brutal timeline, architecture to build the tunnels, the cisterns, the walls, and above all, social organization to marshal the labor, to maintain the systems, to govern the resource fairly across generations. Each oasis was a living synthesis of an entire civilization's knowledge. In that light, these engineered pockets of green become something grander. They were the keystones. The central locking stones in the arch of continental trade. Remove the keystone and the arch collapses. remove the chain of oases, and the Silk Road, the Incense Road, the trans-Saharan routes, they all vanish. The flow of goods, ideas, and people that built the ancient world depended on that calculated, human-made infrastructure. Empires rose and fell, but the need for that reliable corridor remained. The oasis was the fixed point that made the movement possible. It turned the desert from a barrier into a bridge, not by accident but by design. This stands as a quiet rebuttal to an old idea: environmental determinism. The notion that geography alone dictates destiny, that a desert must produce only nomads or silence. The builders of the Kanat, the Foggara, the Karez, the Nabataean cisterns rejected that outright. They looked at the most challenging environment and said, "We will not be determined by this. We will read its secrets, work with its hidden logic, and reshape it just enough to serve our collective ambitions." They proved that human agency, fueled by knowledge and cooperation, could rewrite the rules of survival. They chose to connect continents, and then they built the tools to make that choice a reality. Their legacy isn't one of conquest over nature, but of profound negotiation with it, a negotiation that required humility as much as brilliance. They listened to the land. They understood its limits, and within those limits they orchestrated a symphony of stone, water, and social will. The result was a sanctuary, a repeated, deliberate act of creation in the heart of nothingness. It reminds us that our greatest achievements often arise not in spite of our constraints, but because of them. The desert asked the hardest question. And in their answer, those ancient engineers left a blueprint, not just for survival, but for how to build a world in the most unexpected of places. That legacy is in the water you can't see, in stone that's wearing away. It's the qanats in Persia, the cisterns at Petra, the fossil water tunnels under the Sahara, all part of the same long story, a story of human brilliance. These places, these sanctuaries, they were the silent partner to every great journey. They were the fixed stars, the ones ancient travelers used to navigate, not the sea, but the deserts. The most impossible barriers became bridges because of them. And that story tells you something true. Infrastructure isn't just concrete, it isn't just steel. It's the physical shape of what a society wants most, the will to connect, to trade, to look at a hostile place and understand it so well you can convince it to give life. To thrive not by beating the odds, but by slowly, cleverly changing what the odds are. They saw a map that was mostly empty, and they saw a network, a pattern waiting to be drawn. Their blueprint was in the rhythm of a camel's walk, in the gentle slope of a tunnel floor, in a community standing watch over a single well. It makes you think of the hidden systems now. The grids for power, for data, for all the things that move, the unseen things that let our world work, those are testaments too, to that same will to connect. They're our version of that old urge to reach across the void.